So again, good morning, everyone. I hope everything is well, all good at your end. Um, so let me start by doing a quick recap of the second part of what we were discussing in the last class. You'd recall we were looking at a reading by Mrinal Datta Chaudhary, which was looking at or which was titled Market Failure and Government Failure. Fundamentally, what you were looking at in that text was to understand through policy regimes, references to countries on the nature of state intervention in designing or redesigning market institutions. Our first part of the last class, last Thursday, was looking at understanding the role of markets in order to comprehend the relationship they share with states. How markets function more efficiently, or under what conditions they can function more efficiently, the role of competition in that regard. Those things were sort of at the central aspect of our conversation. The idea was not to sort of give a sort of present a case or advocate for a case for the adoption of markets as sort of the one universal solution to all complex social policy problems, but in fact, to see markets to be identified as tools which can help organize or restructure um, social policy in a manner that allocates not just resources amongst themselves in what was in Smith's term at a lesser cost to what a Leviathan would attempt to do. You can have an absolute estate and still sort of be able to tell people what to buy, what to sell, uh, sort of bring about an exchange of not just merchandise trade, but many things. But the amount of effort, the amount of, I mean, coercive pull that would take in both policy and action would be tremendous. And that the argument that Smith advocated for, and at the time when Adam Smith was writing this, he was sort of critiquing the nature of protective barriers to trade that at that point of time the British Empire had on the entry and exit of goods. It's an irony that much after Adam Smith wrote The Inquiry of Wealth of Nations, he ended up working as a custom officer. I don't know if many people know this at all, but um, I mean, he wanted to do it because I mean his father also had the same job, but as he moved to London, or I mean, maybe that started when he moved to Edinburgh and then London. But he worked as a custom officer, and one of the things he wanted to understand was how duties and restrictions to trade barriers worked. Um, and that was very central to his sort of book. And Inquiry of Wealth of Nations also brought a lot of conversations around what aspect of trade policy works. It's very central to the kind of questions somewhere we're asking today as well. I mean, the barriers to trade that are very much right now part of shaping or reshaping trade negotiations, bilaterally, multilaterally. Mm, the fundamental negotiation points for many tools tend to be, I mean, bucketed between tariffs, quotas, and what are now called as non-tariff barriers, NTBs. NTBs are a relatively new phenomenon. It's like a sort of a late 20th century intervention. For a lot of people who might not know what non-tariff barriers mean, you have restrictions on goods now which tend to come from what you would consider as qualitative restrictions, mm, sort of enforced on goods procurement from a given market based of its compatibility with international, I don't know, humanitarian laws, human right conventions, things like that would be very central to now how a trade deal may or may not work with the country. I mean, if you have extensive degree of child labor involved in the manufacturing of a certain uh, product brand or structure of that brand operating in another country, which is sourcing products which involves an extensive high degree of child labor, you would expect or anticipate that it may be the case that goods shipping may be prohibited or banned. Those conventions were very central to the way in which trade was redesigned. It has also been somewhere in some cases, and the WTO trade dispute history illustrates it quite well. You have now a situation that many countries are not able to engage in productive trade negotiations because of the nature of qualitative checks that are introduced, and there is no framework for NTBs or non-tariff barrier based discussions. It's predominantly much of the discussions in progressive trade liberalization has happened in context to tariffs and quotas. So we have actually moved away from that to discussions on non-tariff barriers, and now sort of gone back to talking about tariffs and quotas in sort of less than a decade. It was conventionally believed that by the 90s, early 90s, much of the discussion on tariffs and quotas was settled, that reduction or having uniform tariffs and quotas. Quotas, for those who don't know, are quantitative restrictions to goods being coming from another country. um, I mean, you have, for example, a restriction on the number of cars that may be coming from another market, and you don't want to promote, let's say, beyond a certain volume of cars coming in as imports. So, quantity based restrictions to trade would be defined by quotas. Price, however, price based restrictions to trade are defined by tariffs. So when Trump sort of announces 33%, 36%, means that if a good is coming from another market, it will be taxed at another 33% of the price at which it was being earlier imported. That governments have leeway on. But it was pretty well settled that tariffs and quotas really don't have a positive, net positive effect um, on affecting the degree of trade relationships between countries. I can go into the details of this because it's a hot topic for many international political economy scholars or international relations scholars as well right now, because trade policy is very central to much of the dialogue. But Smith's, I think, major contribution as an intellectual scholar in this regard, which shaped the foundations of economic thought, modern economic thought, was that market exchange determined by least possible restrictions to trade and under the force of competition can enable markets or exchange of goods to work better. However, as we discussed towards the later part of our discussion in the last lecture, there is a huge restriction to trade, which is enabled by factors that are beyond market-based uh, forces as well. So, to give you an example, I had sort of mentioned of a reference point of a product which is, let's say, a perfume manufactured whose smell maybe is causing harm to people who are sort of around a particular area or in proximity to that smell. Now, a product in that regard can actually be banned or restricted in mobility, independent of which brand it is of and what it does, because of the sort of social utility argument that it is causing harm or nauseatic feeling, or it's a sort of a public health issue. But in that regard, market would require certain checks and balances. And to a lot of advocates who have sort of misconstrued Adam Smith's emphasis on sort of free and fair markets, somewhere this I think logic has been sold that Smith's advocacy was for no regulations or no restrictions to trade. In fact, that was not true at all. In fact, there are two cases where I can mention of Adam Smith advocating for strict regulations. One is in context to goods that have a direct harm on the community at large, right? Any products like, for example, drugs or alcohol or anything that may what be seen as sin goods that can have an effect on people, which should be restricted. And there is a case for a greater extent of government regulation that should be advocated for. So that was one. Second, he mentioned of legislations that are coming on business from any merchants or brokers or intermediaries to be extensively checked and rechecked um, before they are even legislated for in passing. What he meant by that there are certain entities in the larger organizational structure of an economy who are guided only by self interest in terms of maximization of profits. So brokers or intermediaries or distributors, or who we call as wholesalers, in some cases would be guided by that logic, and so would be merchants, because every legislative change that allows them to maximize profits is or would be construed in their interest. So any advocacy of a particular legislative change coming from that group must be extensively scrutinized. So Smith is very clear on all of this. As you closely read him, you get a sort of a more nuanced perspective on many of these issues. However, in the way policy regimes have worked, what you've seen from examples of South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, I think is mentioned briefly, but you have other examples from India and countries. You have state intervening at different ways and forms to regulate for policy restrictions, right? That was one of the things that the reading was talking about. To what extent an extensive degree of control by state inhibits private capital mobility or mobility of investment possibilities, which restricts the ability of markets to do what they can do more efficiently or to encourage competition in a given sector. All of these aspects would have a restrictive, inhibitive, or a sort of an adversarial effect on growth. And the idea or the sort of discussion for much of our conversation today is to talk about more or less in a more sort of taking the economists hat, the economics of growth at large. How does growth really work? There's also an obsessive view on growth, which sometimes makes a lot of the details around the measurement of growth to be of more importance than anything else. We're not concerned too much on the measurement aspect or the diagnostics of growth, but the larger concept of economic growth and how the measurement of it is not only just a function of how much of income or wealth is accumulated, but a lot of other factors that go into it. So just to sort of go back quickly on the two cases, you can have markets designed in a manner that the objective criteria of its effective utilization or its goals are not often met by its own very design or functioning. Now, for any tool which doesn't do the job it is required to do, you look at its design, you look at its handling, or something is sort of there's a manufacturing failure, as you would probably say, in engineering. So either the government's intervention has resulted or caused market failures, as in the intended goals of markets to not be realized, or the absence of any rules of the game have given sort of unchecked or unfettered access to markets to maybe result and cause negative externalities or negative costs as a result of their performative measures. So pollution, extensive degree of environmental harm, social harm, public health concerns of things that are out in the market, all of those which doesn't operate under a regulative structure would see or be seen as a case or example of how markets without any regulations or regulatory net can also fail. The word failure here, I must caution for most people, is doesn't mean there is a sort of a pass and fail measure in understanding how market fails or government fails. Basically, there's an intended objective of every action, and if that intended objective or goal of that action is not met, you would anticipate things to not fall in place or fall in line as per expectations. So if a government policy has a set of goals and it fails to achieve those goals after its implementation, you would say that this is an example of a government failure, because you would bring a policy which would have set objectives and goals, and would want to encourage certain aspects of stakeholder participation. And if it doesn't happen or doesn't work, so to give you an example, let's say we were talking about trade policy. So if changes to trade deals are happening currently as we speak, and it is making domestically prices of goods and services to go up sustainably over a period of time, you would say that this restructuring of trade is not in the interest of the people, because if the very goods that were earlier being consumed were at a price which is much lesser than what one is paying now, trade policy should make goods to be more accessible to consumers for what they want to pay at a lower price, and not the other way around. So, if intended goals of policy interventions do not yield the intended outcomes, you would anticipate that there is, if not abject, but at least some evidence of government failure. And markets too, in a very similar way, with or without government intervention, could have reference. So before I sort of move into our discussion on growth, I just want to sort of close this by taking one example from each one of you of what you would understand by a market failure, with or without government action in a particular context or in a particular space. It could be from any market, it could be from any country, it could be from any space. And it will also help me validate to a certain extent whether what has been explained in context to both the reading and otherwise the topic is clearer to you. Okay. So I'll give you like a few minutes. Just I want you to think a little bit about one example of a market failure with government intervention and one without government intervention. Yes, Peter?
Um, Comes to mind for me is the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, which it's been a while since I studied it, but if I recall, there's kind of a debate that it's some feel it's a market failure, some feel it's a government failure. Because obviously the most straightforward cause was like risky mortgages, which were kind of handed out irresponsibly just to make money. But I remember reading some papers a while ago that like the mortgages themselves. There was some prior government policy requiring mortgages to be given to um, a wider sort of economic array of people in order to like
Mm-hmm.
make home ownership more achievable, which pushed in turn banks to give out risky loans.
Yeah. So I think, of course, so uh, I mean, it's a classic economist's example of how you could understand a crash as, in objective terms, an evidence of both market failure with and without. I mean, there is, in the case of the subprime mortgage crisis of 2007 and 8, you'll find examples of both market failure without government or presence of government regulation, or with one. That is absolutely spot on. For others, I would also say that if you're not coming from an awareness of, let's say, generally the broader functioning of the economy at large, think of also very simple cases where you would like, anticipate um, the market of a particular good or service creating negative externalities, which then either as a result of the lack of government intervention or with one get further accentuated. So even that would work in a very simple manner for others to follow. Francia, do you want to sort of go ahead, please? Yes.
Yeah, just good morning, everyone. I just got thinking about my own sort of group presentation that we did this week, because our example was Turkey. And so Turkey in the 1930s introduced import substitution industrialization policy strategy supported by high tariffs, state-owned enterprises, sorry, and foreign aid. And that provided some GDP growth, but it also, because of the government intervention, it also produced inefficiency in resource allocation, low export competitiveness, chronic current account deficits, and rising inflation. So on protective policy regimes, growth is not backed by adaptable institutions. Growth that is not backed by adaptable institutions is often unsustainable. So that would be a good example of that. But at the same time, I think that not all government intervention is bad. I know that the market doesn't like government intervention because of regulations and cutting into
Yeah.
profit maximization. But for instance, some countries have banned GMO products into their countries. Russia is an example of that. So GMO products, as you know, is genetically modified crops in animals and so things that we eat to make them more weather or bug resistant. But there is implications in human health when it comes to GMOs. And so some countries have decided to either ban or regulate these products. So it works either way, some way to protect the health of the city of the sovereign, people who live in those countries, which industry doesn't like much, but sometimes this government intervention is absolutely necessary.
Absolutely. No, that I mean the GMO example is a very pertinent example within agriculture. I think that it's very pressing right now because of the emerging market economy, trade policy reorientation, which is happening now as we speak. In fact, the last 1 month, I can speak from the sort of Indian discussions in the US, the trade negotiations, that the two big sectors based on which the entire deal currently hinges with India. I mean, India, as you know, is the only country where Trump has not, at this point of time, come extremely hard in putting heavy, egregious tariffs, only because one of the things he's been trying to do with the Indian context is to get unrestricted market access. And the two sectors where India is extremely protective, one reason the GM example was very critical, is agriculture and dairy. I mean, these two also are the most vulnerable sectors in the Indian context. Most 45 to 50% of our workforce is dependent on agriculture and agrarian livelihoods, and almost 70 to 80% of the agrarian workers own less than 2 hectares of land. So that is the nature of crisis, which has been, I think it's a structural crisis in India, which doesn't get fixed. We'll talk about this when we talk about the Indian case. Largely, and by India, if you're talking about pre sort of 1947, which is when you experience or see a partition, you're talking about India largely as the larger part of the subcontinent. And most of these concerns have been there for much of its post-independent past. But the GM example is also particularly critical because many emerging market economies are under extensive pressure to accept relaxations in terms of imports on genetically modified sort of products and crops to find a way into the market. I know typically a few West and East African countries which were facing a similar plight a decade back. So that's a very important example. Anything else that comes to mind, Mackenzie? You want to go ahead, please?
Yeah, so it took me a while to find it in my notes, but in my first year econ class, way back when, we talked about the cod shortage of cod from overfishing in Newfoundland. And like Fisheries Canada had to put like a pause or a suspension on fishing in that community for that specific type of fish. And like over 30,000 fishermen and fish workers related to these fishermen all lost their jobs and had to find new jobs, get like work on new skills elsewhere and that kind of stuff. So I think that's a good Canadian example of market failure as well. I guess more tragedy of commons, but that is what came to mind.
Okay. That's a good one. Anything else? Charlie?
I think for me, what came to mind was the 2022 policies under Liz Truss in the UK, where she slashed the, basically she unveiled one of the biggest tax cuts in the past 50 years, and it absolutely decimated the economy. There was a lot of concern, bonds everything just sort of fell apart, and it ended up leading not only to a mini economical sort of catastrophe, but it also led to her resignation from the government from the government. So I think that's a good example of market failure by government policy that just was not well designed for the needs of the moment.
Yeah. Again, that's a good example from the UK. Louis, sorry, go ahead.
So the example I was thinking of was Venezuela and their oil industry. So I know in the 2000s to the early 2010s, the profits from the oil industry were very successful. But then during this period, government spending was very pro-cyclical and was outpacing the income they were receiving from taxes and other revenues. And then at this time, they were running a double-digit fiscal deficit. I think I saw that they had about $100 billion in debt. So to pay off this debt, they became reliant on their central bank printing money to finance this deficit, but this only increased inflation. And then also during the period of the early 2000s, they were nationalizing their oil industry, but they didn't have the capacity to meet the same level of production. So when oil prices ended up dropping in around 2014, I believe, this ended up causing a huge economic shock that the state wasn't really able to weather. So then they fell back on the central bank printing more money, but then this only caused an extreme increase in inflation, which basically devastated much of their domestic industry.
Yeah, I mean, so Venezuela would give you actually, or for that matter, Argentina would give you multiple cases across sectors, examples of market failures happening as a result of either extensive or a lack of moderate government intervention. I mean, the commodity market is also very difficult market to also regulate. It works better under a float of price. But yeah, I think the kind of turnaround Venezuela saw in its economic landscape because of a mismanagement of commodity price trade, and also the sort of exogenous or external shock to prices of oil for a sustained period of time collapsing in value, and the sort of indirect effect of that being felt more strongly or because of a populist fiscal policy regime, which had extensively pledged a lot of resources on spending on welfare needs. A combined effect of that almost wrecked the economy at large. So I think that's again a very, very good and timely example. Des, and then Elisina.
For me, I thought of the case of the Philippines under the dictatorship. The public utilities like water, electricity at that time were controlled by the government. So they monopolized that market, and of course that resulted to them the services of these or providing these public utility were poor. The allocation was not enough for the people. Eventually, when the administration changed and the dictatorship ended, the next government policy implemented was privatization of these public utilities. But then, eventually now these private institutions became monopolies as well, and they set the price for these public utilities that should have been like lower payment for these to be provided to the people.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if
It's a
that
good,
would be
it's a
the
good example.
application of market failure.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know there is a tail end to it which has an implication, but again, that's a useful reference. Elisina, do you want to go ahead with your reference? Yeah. Thank you.
My example was kind of similar to Des. It's about like the water war that happened in Bolivia, like at the end of the um like early 2000 and end of like 1999, I think. And so the water was like a public, and then they decided to like privatize the water. And the company that was in charge of it, the prices kind of went up, and there was kind of like this inequality between like the rich and the poor that has access to it, and that led to like a war in the country because the citizen kind of were against the privatization. And after like a couple of like months of or year about so, it went back to being a public. But again, there were still like the issues of like who get access to what and how the government could like distribute the water to like the population, especially in the rural and indigenous areas.
Hmm. The absence of price ceiling or a cap on maximum price or the determination of a price floor, a minimum price on goods tend to often disrupt um, markets or the allocation of price mechanism in market control factors. And I think your case is a classic reference there when you give an extensive control to private sector determination of prices of essentials, particularly in this case, water, or electricity in that regard. For many countries, electricity, which is entirely the ownership distribution of that happens through private sector companies, price has been a big factor, and the state mostly is able to regulate by bringing references to introducing a price ceiling, as in you can't charge over and above a particular price. And the criteria for that price ceiling then becomes a big subject of discussion within the private sector. So this is, again, as a classical case, this is very central to the nature of challenges that you're there. So that excellent example, Des and listener, thank you. Yes, Ikram, Asiya, and then Marulius.
So the example I was thinking of is China's economic growth. When at the beginning of their growth, there was no environmental regulations. So their factories were operating with minimal environment protection, which had very dire consequences on the health of the population, and their environment. So the government had to intervene and impose regulations. It's true, like looking today, they still have a long way to go. They still have some challenges, but this has improved the environment. The government subsidizing technological upgrades, which makes the factories produce cleaner, have cleaner production methods. So yeah,
I think their example in this case of the reference point would be less of a market or a government failure, but in fact, externalities being mitigated by the introduction of certain measures by the government, which allowed for cleaner energy production and also the reduction in pollution measures. I mean, in the China case, one big example that often comes to mind is its coercive measure to manage population growth, which had a clear impact on the demographics of labor market composition. Now, I mean, it's experiencing more of those concerns now because very high amount of the working age population is shrinking. And as a result of the sort of nature of measures taken on combating population growth 15, 20 years back, in fact, longer than that period. So while it may not, I mean, to the only reference it would work would be in a labor market scenario that an extensive amount of government intervention and coercion introduced policies to combat, which in the near term may have addressed the population issue or the population growth issue, but it had serious implications on the Chinese sort of workforce at large, which is what it is experiencing currently. So that might be a bit, I think, more reflective of the nature of market failure and government failure reference. But that's so point taken. That's helpful. Asiya, do you want to go ahead, please? You're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking in the Canadian context, I was two examples, but the first one is rent control, where, the government has tried to implement rent control, but it has had, terrible unintended consequences. It has created a black market for rent. There's a rental shortage, and, the problem that it was trying to solve in making it, equitable and creating access, it has not really worked. And the other example, I'm not sure if this would this fits your question, would be the contentious carbon tax, which has, the Canadian government tried to implement and then actually backtracked on it recently because, and that was definitely linked to implementation. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, but the emissions didn't go down, and it was highly unpopular as a tax. And I think the same thing happened in areas of Europe as well. So that's where the government is having a very difficult time in actually enacting a policy and in terms of climate change and a way forward.
No, so both excellent examples. I think rent is and just the management of this is a big question. I see one candidate who's making a lot of waves in the New York City mayor race now, sort of taking this issue head on freezing rents and that being central to his campaign. And I feel that that's at the crux of perhaps 50 to 60%, if not less, of the main price issue for urban consumers. Rent often is also not very well represented in the consumer price index measurement. I've been doing some sort of analytical review of price indices that are sort of designed to measure inflation in countries. And you'll find something interesting that most countries, while they have some representation of rental prices, they don't have actually good ways or mechanisms to include it in the overall measurement criteria. And so a lot of times what you're paying, so if you're paying more for the milk that you buy or the bread you buy, that is more likely to be accurately reflected in the consumer price index measurement or the inflation measurement process. But if you're paying a lot on rent, there are very limited ways and mechanisms to sort of accurately reflect. But in the lived experience of a lot of people, that happens. So on the carbon taxation, the one big problem that is happening in markets where you've seen two things already happening. The marginal income or indirect tax have already gone up in these countries. And Canada is paying, I was talking to someone very recently about this, that the last 10 years, whenever occasionally I've visited here, I've seen the indirect tax proportion is just sort of taken off. It's substantive now to what you're buying. And that is on top of what you're paying in income and sort of federal tax and other things. So people are not in any way, I think, feeling that they are being given much of a relief, in terms of what they are getting already taxed for. The other is incomes have shrunk. Real wages or real incomes have not grown at the level at which prices have, or in otherwise, what you'd expect people to do. So what is happening is the middle income group and the lower middle income group, particularly in urban areas, is sort of really hit. And it's a story of not just, I would say, one market. You can compare this very considerably across the board. And as a result, any new introduction of as progressive a tax that you might see may not be received with that fervor. And carbon tax story is a lot like that. It's, as much as you're absolutely right, as much as the design or the intention behind the tax may make a lot of sense in theory, but as it is being implemented, it is being resisted because it's happening at a time where these two other factors are also dominant. And without incomes rising, any effect to tax more indirectly or directly would have issues. Yes, Marilis, and then Steph and Ikram.
Yeah, I have two examples as well. I'm not sure if the second one is very relevant, but the first one is the demonetization of like in India in 2016 to eradicate what is oh my God, to
Black money.
eradicate the black money and corruption, but it also negatively impacted many agricultural laborers and informal sector workers and small business areas and rural areas. And the second one is that the implementation of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, where it was a good motive to keep a clean India, but all it was doing was to promote, like, to employ caste discrimination, where the Dalits were employed to clean everything. So I'm not sure if that was very relevant to the question that I asked, that you asked. Sorry.
Example, it needs to be drawn out more in terms of where and how it's resulted in market failures, so as to speak. But demonetization, spot on. It's one of those big policy shocks that are completely unprecedented in history. It's much like the nature of lockdown that India experienced during COVID. Both of these were sort of extreme, banal, measures. Lockdown not so much criticized because everybody was feared and afraid of what the virus may do, but with demonetization, it was just a shot in the racing wheels of a very fast moving car out of nowhere. So that's quite accurate. Steph, do you want to go ahead, please, and then Ikram? Yeah.
Sure. So I have a pretty specific example. I'm not sure how relevant it is, but I was gonna talk about Bolivia, and the fact that they have the largest lithium reserves, and despite having the largest lithium reserves in the world, they still have kind of failed in managing to properly join the international market with a significant amount of production, especially compared to their neighbors, Argentina and Chile. And the first point to note is that in Bolivia's constitution, it's supposed to be clear that no private party, whether it's a foreign or domestic investor, has the right to participate in lithium's production chain unless given, I guess, expressive consent by the natives in the area. And despite this, in 2021, the government turned to FDI to help industrialize their lithium with a bidding campaign. And the company they awarded the contract to has, in 2025, yet to provide any information about the investment schedule, the construction plan, or business model for a bid they received in 2021. So another example of just bad handling of the lithium industry industrialization.
Thank you, Steph, so much. One of the things which is so fascinating about this interaction, and I also miss the in-person time because of the nature of examples. So, like, I have absolutely no idea of the nature of issues that Bolivia would have had. But what happens is, as you speak, sometimes I make notes and I look into these cases, and they really sort of fascinate me. So, thank you so much for suggesting that. I think, Ikram, you had a point, but then you lowered your hand, virtual hand.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it. I was going to ask if COVID-19 can be considered as a market failure, because Uh, well, people were not incentivized to get vaccinated, so the government had to intervene and to make it a requirement. So I'm not sure. This was my question.
I think the answer to that is more in reference to the nature of response to the pandemic and sort of the degrees of proportionality in the nature of lockdown measures that were announced. I'm trying to look at the scholar is a historian in the UK who wrote this book, and um, yes, I think it was titled The COVID Consensus. For those interested, I know Professor Green quite well because he's a collaborator on many projects with us. But this became a very interesting uh, sort of, maybe not in direct connotation to what we are discussing here now, but let me just share this with you. COVID census. So this might be of a very good read just to help explain and understand what you're saying in that the pandemic and the response actually to the pandemic caused a massive divide in context to the nature of effect of those policies on people in very different terms. And in cases of countries where there was already deep within inequalities, the effect of these were feel and felt more starkly, and the knowledge was all coming from outside the country at large, because everybody was relying on not just WHO but many other sort of industrialized world based institutional networks, and that had a huge impact. So this was one of the best, I think, sellers in the UK for pretty long around that period of time. There was a coalition of scholars, I think, coming together, and what he'd done was also set up amongst he's a West African actually historian, Toby Green. He's done nothing on COVID, but it was a response to what was happening. So maybe this might be of interest, as you were saying, of context. I have two scenarios, guys, just for you to, I think, on a more provocative note, perhaps to a certain extent, but these are hypothetical scenarios, so take those as one. And I'm putting this in the chat box so you can read this as you see. So imagine a scenario where in situation one, you'd have more than 50% of reservation for indigenous communities in Canadian labor market across sectors that are introduced. How would you assess the impact of this at large in the way you can study the economy, or just basically look at the labor market? The second is a 25% hike in minimum wage, and its impact on the Canadian labor market scenario. So both are sort of examples from how it may affect workers versus employers in the Canadian context. But affirmative action tends to be quite extensively argued, advocated for, and much like the issue that earlier I think Asya mentioned about carbon tax, there's a lot of positive reinforcement of this, but as and when this actually gets implemented, there are polarizing verdicts. And in a similar context, if you want to sort of look at hike in minimum wage, you want to just see how this may or may not impact. So any thoughts, reflections on these? Maybe just if you want to take a minute or two, might be sort of worth reflecting on. And it's a different cohort, right? Everybody's coming from different disciplines. So it's sometimes interesting to know how you would interpret this. I think the points are clear, right? Like one is talking about a case that is a policy reference, or maybe just as a pilot test, argues for or has 50% reservation or more for all registered or identified indigenous groups. And in second case, we're talking about a 25% hike in minimum wage. So what's the current minimum wage? And I think it's provincial, right? So Ontario would have what? This point of time, I have no idea the recent numbers.
I think it's 17 and a half, something like that. No?
17.5. So yeah, so I mean maybe it's the north of that 20 is what the rate is put as. So you have $20 set as the minimum wage or something like that. So how would this sort of have any kind of effect on the overall macro labor market scenario? Oh, Francia, yeah.
Yeah, I think on the second point about the 25 hike in minimum wage law and impact on Canadian labor, you know, it depends on how you see it and from which point do you see it. Are you seeing it from the point of the labor, the people who work, or are you seeing it from the point of the businesses and you know that market? Because due to rise in inflation, due to the cost of the basket of goods, you know, it's been raised significantly since last 3 years or so because of inflation, because of recuperating from COVID, because I will say some nonsensical government decisions, which contributed to more, you know, thoughtless expenses that contributed to more inflation. And also, you know, we see high rise on interest rates. And on top of that, you know, a spike on everything, on rent, on food, because of tariffs. So the cost of living keeps going up and up and up. And so the minimum wage just doesn't keep up with that. And so you have people struggling to find jobs that keep up and struggling in their lives that keep up with the current cost of living. And then corporations get taxed way less than people get taxed, right? So they, in Ontario, perhaps they get taxed at 20%. But like if you think about a province like Quebec, personally, you get taxed at 19%. So you're almost getting taxed as much as a corporation in Quebec if you're an individual. So you have to look at different variables in order to assess what that 25% hike minimum wage and that who really affect, right? And so it benefits the people who are participating in the labor market and that have to pay for the goods that all the companies are providing and so on and so on. And so the industry or the you know, businesses, of course, they're not gonna like that. But then, you know what I mean? It's like, where do you balance out things so that your population doesn't continue to struggle to make ends meet, you know, to live, while businesses continue to just focus on profit maximization. So those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, excellent reflections. I think the three main areas that come often in mind with assessing minimum wage aspects in labor market is to look at it from how it may affect labor intensive modes of businesses, production, distribution, or any kind. The word labor intensive is key because businesses have different aspects of capital involvement. In some cases, you may not have as many workers hired, and to you, paying someone 25% more who's an indispensable part of your assembly line of manufacturing in a sort of a limited sense, which is very heavily kept capital reliant or machinery reliant, may not be sort of as bad as it may seem. But if you have a high or relatively high labor intensive mode of production, scenario is very different. So the employer context then becomes critical. The consumer also, sorry, the worker context is critical based on exactly what you're saying, which is general prices going up over time, inflation, and many other factors making sort of livelihoods and incomes or real incomes of communities at almost a stagnating or declining level. So the government comes up with this as a way to sort of address sort of income stagnation and the need for more and higher disposable income in the hands of people and workers. and positively reinforcing those who are already employed. The third spectrum is on those who are entering the workforce, right? You would anticipate. So I'll give you a small reference point, which is I was in banking jobs. I would see people in summer jobs being open to having undergraduate students 5 years back or 6 years back. I think this is pre-COVID. You could have certain positions where undergraduate students in, I think, the third or fourth year could get a summer job. I think now mostly a lot of those jobs that as a banker was telling me are going to graduate students. So what has really changed is it's not as if that the requirement has gone out. It's just that those who are at an undergraduate level or may look at a 2 or 3 months or a 4-month sort of a temporary work position may not easily find one because the wages or the potential wage structure that an employer has is such that it wants to now equate the skill sets of a graduate student with of an undergraduate student, and somewhere that may not be an accurate representation, but it's just a sort of a market readjusting itself to what is happening across the board. So these are the three, I think, spectrums that one tends to look and evaluate it from, and then I think that's where reflections might sort of come in. So thank you for that, Francia. Excellent thoughts. Laura, do you want to just sort of come in? Yeah.
So on the topic of like rising minimum wage, I'm kind of thinking of the service industry since that's where a lot of minimum wage jobs are. And so I would, and especially in the service industry, like the food industry, like I think this could have an impact on tipping culture. If, wages are going up, there may be less pressure overall from the general public to be tipping on top of that. I also think from like an employer standpoint, if minimum wages are going up, they're going to be trying to cut costs wherever they can. So I'm thinking they might be hiring less people to be doing, these jobs in like cafes and restaurants and stuff like that, so that the people who have these jobs might be making, a bit more money, but they're going to be overburdened with like maybe responsibilities that they can't handle, or just like they can't handle the amount of people that they're responsible for in their job. So I think, raising minimum wage always seems like a good idea since, it's very clear that minimum wage has not been keeping up with the costs of living. But I think especially a jump by something like 25% could have a lot of like detrimental effects.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just reading out what Francia said on modernization, automation, and how that's sort of left a lot of minimum wage workers out of jobs. Okay, anyone else? So this point number 1, which is I think still left out. What if both are coming at the same time? All right, let's I think add a little more to this, which is both are announced in sort of really short intervals, and while they're a popular mandate to do these things, what its effect might be. Yes, Asya, please. Yeah.
Yes, Professor Mohan, I was actually wanted some clarification on point 1, but I'll be very honest, I can't imagine in what scenario we could actually have point 1. It just seems,
So which is why I clarified at the beginning saying it's a hypothetical, maybe if it's
Yeah,
happened.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
maybe
mean,
I'm
a
just
lot of
doing.
people, the second one is it may seem radical to many people, the second one, which is 25% minimum wage is like, I mean, even Bernie Sanders in the US, as radical as sometimes Bernie Sanders can get on minimum wages, would advocate max, I think, 15%. So I was conscious, but yes, let's see what everybody has in mind. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, 50% reservation of indigenous communities. So you're talking about integrating indigenous communities into the markets, right? That is, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the question. Yeah,
Jobs, 50% of those would be reserved for members of the indigenous communities, those identified by the federal government.
right. I mean, I think that would be absolutely fantastic in theory, of course, but I maybe I'm just too involved in this subject to see how, but you know, you're fair. It's a scenario. I think it would potentially change the structure of the economy in Canada. Like I think, just having, that sort of integration, which is so different from, the capitalistic structure that we live in, it would actually change how we do business in Canada. So I think it would be incredible, but I think it would just be a remarkable shift in the systems that we have right now, because it would just not affect just the markets, because the social and the cultural aspects of it would have a huge impact into having those kinds of jobs available. Anyway, I'm not doing a very good job, because I guess I'm just that's a wonderful hypothetical, but maybe my bias is just getting in the way of my imagining something so wonderful.
The idea is to sort of, see, this is what classrooms are for, right? Like to really think out of the box and come up with when I say 50%, maybe you'd start with 10% somewhere, and in next 10 years you're in a very influential role, and somebody says, I had this sort of crazy session taking half of our class talking about a radical idea as such as this. But since Canada thrives so much on many much aspects constitutionally on multiculturalism and factors of so many things, it may be worth sort of exploring
Yeah,
some.
but that is just smoke and mirrors, right? Canada doesn't really. It likes to think of itself like that, but it doesn't really. I mean, structurally, it is just as any white supremacist system. So it does. I mean, our indigenous populations are in ruins across Canada in every possible way, socially, culturally, from an educational perspective, health. So anyway.
uh, yeah, we'll stick to trying to speculate how, if you do have a scenario where someone, as radical a person comes into power and has a huge popular mandate, and by radical I mean not in a sense of a negative tone of being an outrageous irrational person, but someone who's sort of trying to bring big sort of structural change in short periods of time. So how would this play out? The idea here really is, in principle terms, is to look at how labor market structures get impacted when there is reservation. I could have probably said, let's say 50% reservation for women in general, um, in all jobs, right? And it's a bill tabled in the Indian Parliament right now. It's passed, but they're looking at the execution aspect of reservation for women, and for, I think it's 50% for all legislative structures and institutions as well. It's already there at a very decentralized level, but it's been there in works for 18 years in India. And when it was first proposed, people thought it was completely idiosyncratic to argue for that, because India's informality in the labor landscape is so wide, as I've spoken about earlier, that there was not much consensus in organized jobs to have affirmative action, because there's already affirmative action of 50% among scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other communities that by constitution you have. So on top of that, adding another group was for a lot of people not. But what was seen as something which would not possibly ever happen has been realized. It's been passed. Both houses did that, and it's now sort of tabled for implementation. So for now, I mentioned of indigenous communities because it's a talk of a huge impetus amongst policymakers where there is allocation of more research funding. I mean, if I'm a researcher now in Canada coming in and presenting a sort of a grant proposal which looks at vulnerabilities of indigenous communities, I'm more likely to get funding now as I could maybe 10 years back. So yeah, there's some degree of change, but I do understand and get your point on the larger scheme of things. Yes, Ikram, sorry, you want to go ahead, please?
Yeah, I was thinking about the effect this might have on the labor market, because this might cause, this might force a majority of business to hire from a specific pool, regardless of their qualifications. So I'm thinking it's going to have an overall effect on productivity and efficiency in general. And businesses might struggle to compete and find skilled workers. And so this is the effect on the labor side or the economy side. It's going to have also an effect on the social side. It might cause resentment because there's going to be a lot of maybe job displacement, and non-indigenous individuals are not going to be able to have the same opportunities as indigenous individuals.
Okay, anyone else? Thank you, Ikram. Yeah. Let me just see if there's somebody who's not spoken. Yes, Francia, do you want to go ahead, please?
Yeah, no, just a comment about like when you were speaking about making sure that we have policies that introduce more women into the labor market in India, or policies here in Canada to make sure that we're taking care of our indigenous peoples, and making the necessary changes like honoring the land claims and so on. So it's like I thought for that it's often the clash between cultural traditions, colonial history, and modernization that makes it challenging to establish concise implementation policies, resulting in latency. That's sort of my thought. But when we talk about the labor market as well, the labor market is going to suffer some quite rigid changes coming up in the next 2 decades or so. And that's because of agentic AI, generative AI, and AI in general. In my line of work, I often see how companies are putting everything they can in order to implement those things because it saves them time and profit. It increase their profit. It's a lot better to have one person babysitting the AI than have 10 people doing the job that the AI can do. So you see reports on the Economic Forum, Future of Work, things like that, where it showcases the jobs that are going to be lost to AI and AI implementation across. And we've seen that, like I said, Royal Bank closed about 2,000 branches or more in the last year because people using the mobile app and not a lot of people going to branches themselves. So in terms that saves money it saves them money, and it makes everything more efficient. But there's a lot of jobs that got lost when those branches were closed. And it affected a lot of the older generation as well, who are used to going to the branch and having that service rather than, So, and we're going to see that more and more and more coming. So there's going to be a shift in the labor market and what that's going to look like in the next decades. And my question is, how are governments, preparing for the loss of jobs that is coming or the transition that is coming in the future in terms of labor? It's something food for thought.
Yeah, I mean, much of those answers that need to come from is from predominantly us, because when I say us as a collective, see, there is one of the big reasons of a wave of anti-intellectualism, so as to speak, which is triggering the whole world at large, is because academic deliberations have increasingly become disconnected with the nature of ground realities that countries experience. I don't say that universally across the board or just a sort of a blanket umbrella thing, but I've seen in social science particularly many fields, I think somewhere are in silos discussing critical questions, but not sort of coming together. And popular writings amongst academics are heavily debated. I'm sort of one of those few people who've taken positions in the Indian context on policy issues where I'm critical of the government, but it doesn't mean that that's the only thing I'm writing about. I'm also sort of working on academic sort of work which is disconnected from those policy. But somewhere the public intellectual function of an academic at large is more pressing than ever before. And I think one of the reasons is precisely to address what Francia is saying, which is how do you make sense of such rapid and disconnect? It's so one interesting thing, it's not the first time in history that you're seeing as wide as if a disruption that is happening right now. I mean, technology led disruption has happened before. Degrees may matter, like extent of that may matter. We've seen on climate change and sort of event shaping communities, their lives, livelihoods. So there is a lot of precedent in history to go back and learn from, but at the same time, how do you prepare for a more resilient or inclusive future while taking care of many of the issues at hand and understanding the complexities of the status quo of the elite? You know, when I say the elite, as in institutional stakeholders who have had a vested interest in controlling and securing a sort of a rent-seeking function in whatever they do. And even that has been seeing a disruptive effect. I mean, this whole movement towards what is being seen as the right, political right or center right, is a function of that discontentment or resentment against the sort of established status quo of the elite. Now, what is happening is it is being substituted by another presence of a new form of an elite structure, which is being replaced across the board in many countries. And I think one of the reasons why all of this is happening, because the conversation that you're having, there's less and less of that as a part of a pose to question for research and deliberation. So if you were to sort of identify how you would look at, let's say, two things, colonial history and modernization, right? So that how do you make sense? So I can give you a sort of immediate reference point, right? Like if you go and look at Acemoglu's Power and Progress book, which is, I mean, I feel a sort of a must read for anyone trying to understand the history of technological change and its effect on societies, social institutions, political institutions. Of course, predominantly, as much as is the case, 70% of your reference examples may be based out from the industrialized developed north, and there is a less representation of cases from, let's say, South Asia or Southeast Asia or parts of different parts of Africa. Um, that may be the case, but I think a lot of the principles being debated here give you a useful lens. At the same time, you could look at examples of other bodies of work amongst young sort of scholars who are dealing with these questions as sort of central. So there is a conscious need, I feel, that amongst especially graduate students to identify a given topic based on what they find as the realizable concern of what's really affecting their I mean, I have, like, in the one of the courses I teach back in my home university in India, I have we have this immersive learning sort of module, and we call this sort of a neighborhood led project example of you just identify an issue of what's happening in your neighborhood and sort of try to address that as part of your research project. In some cases, people come up with direct interventions of what may help, do conduct pilot sort of interventions. In some cases, anybody who wants to study the context of the nature of issue can do that. And I mean, exercise is our imagination of the way we think about these issues have to really sort of change. If there is so much change happening all across us, there is within academy, I think, also pressure to cause that status quo. So I'm very glad that, I mean, some of these issues are being put forth as we take this. All right, just before I sort of move further, I want to sort of take any final reflections on some of these points, at least sort of going back on point 1 and 2. Is there anyone who has not been able to speak? Or Rejma, do you want to sort of add anything? Marta, anything from your end that you'd want to sort of observe? And yes, Asiya, then please.
Yeah, no, I don't. I just wanted to follow up on what you said about the academy, under attack, and in terms of, the social sciences, because this is, especially at this level and beyond, scholarship leads some of these transformational changes in society in terms of, coming up with new ideas and critical analysis and all of that. I wonder though, I mean, I'm probably dating myself, but back in the 80s, Alan Bloom wrote this book, it was called The Closing of the American Mind, and it was sort of a critique on American universities and this notion of, universities becoming lazy in many ways in trying to, challenge students and society at large to think about these larger issues. And so this has been coming for a very long time. The current state that we're in has a lot to do with, various changes, probably linked more to capitalism and the fact that social sciences is not seen um, as bringing anything of real value. I mean, I have friends who are academics who left academia, and they say, I mean, they got their PhDs, but they make very disparaging comments about, the academy in itself, saying, what, well, these are just useless, degrees and ideas and thoughts. So, but this probably has been coming for a very long time, and I wonder then, dating back 100 years ago, if this was a struggle even back then for the social sciences to sort of, um, find their place in society. What do you think about that? Do you think this is a long-standing issue, or are we seeing something that's very different?
No, so I mean, if you look at just understanding the nature of issues involved within academia at large, in terms of, I mean, there are many things from looking at curriculum to pedagogy to sort of many aspects of how the practice of sort of encouraging teaching has been substituted by an overemphasis on institutional rankings, which rely a lot on research outcomes and publications. So academics would feel that you'd rather gain more by spending more time focusing on research, and teaching is just something just to make your ends meet. And a lot of people would say this behind closed doors, but I see that happening now more and more. And as a result, they don't invest the degree of time that one would in encouraging discussions that really matter, because you would get into the other thing is on just political correctness. I think it's a big issue. I face this myself because I'm sort of traveling in between countries and sort of getting into cross-cultural conversations, and sometimes you're just, I think, how I would probably act. So there's a fine line between responsibility and being afraid, right? Like just saying something that you feel is important. Like even an example like the one that I'm proposing as a hypothetical here may make a lot of people feel, okay, why is just only one community or one group with being spent? Or does that community or group, by the very latent assumption of an example, need affirmative action? How is that thought? So the point is actually not that it could be any X, Y, or Z, but why is that in a nature of discourse or our conversations, we are so deeply identified by the kind of concerns we feel or experience. Maybe we becoming too serious with everything that's happening around, and that leaves aside not just humor or engagement, but dialogue. I mean, for any culture of orality to be nurtured in, which is central to academia at large. I mean, research happens as a culminating point of an individual's point of departure from what was said in class and said, okay, sounds interesting. Let me read up and see what I can find. But ultimately, initially, the trigger point is what you start as a deliberative standpoint, right? What happens, and I don't think the crisis has been right there. The issue really in the last sort of 50 years has been originated from the institutional bifurcation of private and public uh, distinction that academia experienced. It started from much so in the US, where public funding, and the US example is important because US was in its sort of presence of moral exceptionalism, the sort of main anchor point for a lot of change happening across the world, across sectors. I mean, the fall of the sort of Soviet Union and rise of international financial institutions based out of the American sort of anchored world made things so much dependent on what the US does and doesn't do, that many of the change was seen in that regard. So academia, like healthcare, these two big sectors, which are in certain senses the moral responsibility of state, a nation state, that understanding of their public good functionality just completely evaporated. And then universities, because of a lack of funding now coming from, and Canada is facing now what the UK did 10 years back in terms of its higher education scene. I'm speaking to a lot of university administrators and leaders, and that's the sense I'm getting. And I'm like, okay, well, one has to be at an institutional level be more prepared, because it's not like you're an exceptional actor. It's just part of something which has happened in another country 30 years back, in another country maybe 10 years back, and it's now affecting you. But everybody would be part of that churn. So you need to have diversified revenue models, have programs that are part of your revenue generating scheme, so that you're not vulnerable when public funding gets cut out. There is a big issue of scholarships, which is effectified, uh, you know, diversity of representation in many of the classrooms. So sometimes certain issues may not really find that much of agency and space. Um, I was mentioning to you earlier about women, the question of women. Now, the Indian context, women voters are swinging elections one way or the other, and it is such an assertive presence of the women vote bank that it is now constituted as its own base completely. And I'm quite sure it's not an Indian story. It's just happening across the board. There was a huge wave of protest movements which are being anchored by young women across the board. And I think somewhere what one needs to really understand, and again, the gender question is also not restricted just to women. I mean, you have the LGBTQ community. I feel somewhere all of that becomes very important. But the academia's sort of diminishing utility of its presence in public engagement is a function of its distance from grassroots level uh, engagement. And that's something which I recognize by whatever limited knowledge I have is sort of a more contemporary realization. I think that the focus on orality in teaching, a passing of what's really happening, preparing a group of individuals for the nature of challenges in the future, those are very central to academic discourse always. I mean, at least in social science, humanities, philosophy, those fields I'm talking about. But it's changed huge ground and space in the last, I think, in particularly post 2000s, so as to speak. But the change and the seed of that change started when public funding started cutting out in the US. Many institutions started moving away for what the industry wants. You had a bunch of huge rise of dependence on MBAs and other sort of degrees, and that shifted and made humanities department less or social science department less relevant. I mean, if you look at the top universities, very few universities which are outside, which are in the non-STEM category, are anywhere there in the top performing criteria. So that bias is, I think, embedded in the way we assess institutional measures. And I think that's now, it's a sort of a lonely battle because academia also lack solidarity movements within its own context. I mean, economists are almost fundamentally divided on everything that they discuss. I have a particularly difficult time dealing with a lot of my economics peers because I'm sort of heading an interdisciplinary research institute at my home university, and last 2 years I've been seeing what the other scholarly group, which is very difficult to sort of bring together and have any culture of socialization. I mean, you start somewhere there, that come read a paper, let's invite thoughts and responses. So the nature of challenges that are affecting, I think, just as an institutional form, academia at large, are a function of, I feel, this distinction of very well resource endowed private institutions versus public. Now you see with the debate that Harvard was experiencing, the Trump administration, and many others like Columbia and others, even private institutions or those which are in the elite league are not escaping that route. So, but as an individual, I feel, I think where social science is struggling, there's a crisis of theory. Clearly, there's a crisis of theorization, which is affecting the questions that earlier I think Francia asked, which is how do you make sense of history and the challenge of modernization? I mean, this has been debated, addressed in theory every century, and in fact, you've had new frameworks coming up, which has helped the next sort of 10 years, 20 years. But the word that you use, the sort of lazy intelligentsia or the inertia, so as to speak, within the academic, I think, spectrum has been definitely massive. I mean, I'll be honest, like what I see here in the Canadian sort of institutional network is particularly isolating. The word, which is that I would start by talking about the subcontinent or South Asia for that matter, and half of the people would not be interested in knowing what's really happening. And how does it matter? We're sitting in sort of a million miles away, and how does this affect our own? But that's changed. I mean, in the last, I mean, I started first, I think, doing a course in India 2014, if I remember, and I then brought China and then comparative examples from other countries. So with years, I saw that yes, there are ways to sort of getting into that conversation, but you always need examples from your own lived sort of experience to make sense to that. And you have to keep making that effort. And I think as teachers, that is what the teacher's mandate is. So the two of those big things, then funding, what's happening in generally in social science, and I think the sort of substitutive replacement of research over teaching in the valuation of an academic job, I think has added to some of these concerns. But happy to talk and discuss about these things more, I think, on the sidelines of. I probably would want to sort of take the conversation forward at this point to enable two part readings that we need to sort of look at. I would encourage, so that the text has already been read, I believe, by almost everyone who's participated in the group exercise. But there's certain aspects within the text, that is the introduction of the In Search for Prosperity reading, which will be central to our discussion. Uh, and this will spill over to our session on Thursday as well. So that's why I was taking a little of our time today to sort of draw this thing out. So if you were to just go on, let me see if I can. Yeah. So if you were to look at the text on In Search for Prosperity and maybe go into its first chapter, there's what I want you to do is sort of look at page 1-8 in one continuum and the 9 to 17, um, sort of the last page in another continuum. For those who have done sort of already this multiple times, that's fine. You can have a list of questions that you can keep in mind as you sort of look at these sections of the text. I'll come to those questions in a bit, but what I'm sort of asking you to do, okay, just tell me what you see in front of the screen right now, because I don't know what are you seeing. Are you seeing the text or are you seeing the presentation? The text, right? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So in the text, there are two aspects of discussion. I mean, one is with respect to the talking about the economics of economic growth, or the diagnostics or the measurement of economic growth. And there's a particular explanation here which is very critical, is the organizing principles aspect. And this talks a little bit about not just, so leave this equation aside. I mean, don't get too bothered with the equation. Basically, income is seen as a function of how productive land, labor, capital, all of these factor endowments are. So they talk a little bit about that, which is a pretty sort of straightforward decomposition, but they move to the conversation around these 3 points, which is on geography, institutions, and integration. I think that's very central to the way we expand on our discussion on growth. And as each one of you had looked at countries that you had studied as a reference point, we'll come to what of those countries were and how did you understand or relate to their growth stories by looking at a certain aspect of their country's profile, colonial history, institutional base, integration, or geography for that matter, anyone. But this organizing principle based conversation on the taxonomy of growth, which has expanded its meaning from just being looked at income accumulation to other areas as well, is essential and critical. So what you may want to do is to look at the first sort of 6 to 7 and 8 pages, and then understand that what these terms, institutions, trade, and geography mean. There's, if you see on page number 8, you'll find this discussion briefly on interrelationships. I think this is very critical for you to understand how the study of these relationships is central. In fact, for those, when, if you have, I think, a dissertation thesis to write as part of your graduate degree, or for those with working on any research studies, the nature of interrelationships you find more intriguing. Are frameworks you can always adopt in case of any country or any period of time you want to study within a country as well. And that has really helped researchers, I think, take those dialogues forward. What I want, I think, most of our time spent, and this will feature as part of a longer conversation also on Thursday, is what you see from page number 9 onwards. And from page number 9, you'll be seeing the page here, which will be the questions, right? You see this? Is this visible? Yeah. So when you see the questions, now what questions is the author here talking about? There's certain questions which are assumptions or conceptual questions about the relationships that each of the determinant of growth has. I think that those are the questions that they're talking about in terms of their answer by looking at different countries and their narratives. Now, these country-based narratives are emerging from what's there in the book. So it's good to just have a perspective on that. But I'm quite sure that there are certain country-based examples you've yourself read as part of the evaluation, which you may want to use as a reference point. But these points of characteristic features, right, like quality of institutions being key, why do quality of institutions matter, right, and to what extent they play a role, trade or specifically government policy may not play as important as a role as institutional setting. I mean, you can debate this one way or the other. In fact, depending on the example that you're most aware of. So you might have a reference of a country in mind where trade does matter and trade policy does have a huge role to play. So the idea here is not to agree with what the author is saying, but to really look at what is being said as a question or a point and then debate it based on the example you have. The references chosen here in explaining each of the points are from the text. So in fact, for those interested in reading through, let's say, an example on Mauritius or Botswana or Australia for that matter, you can just look at, there's a fascinating text on Pakistan as well, which is to this, I think it's the last chapter, one of the few papers that look a lot at the issues of the economic history of growth there. Geography is not destiny, and these points, right? So I'd probably urge you to have a note of the points and then look at these points very closely with reference to what country-based examples you have. So that's what we are going to first do, and I'll sort of draw out then the framework more closely and discuss that and spill much over our conversation then going into Thursday. So I'm roughly if you take or add the 5-minute break, giving you sort of around 30 to 35 minutes. We'll start by 10:45. I want you to kindly take, I think, some time in splitting your focus of reading to both, as I said, page 1 to 8 first, just for context, and then 9 to 17, where each point that is mentioned here, you can make a note of each of these points and then argue one way or the other based on the example you know best. There are examples discussed here. You can follow those, of course. But since you all had some example references from the cases you were looking at in your presentation, you can also use those as a reference point. Okay. So yeah, that would be all at this point that you may sort of start doing. On the questions which we will be looking at, I think that will be more central to our Thursday's dialogue. So I'll come to that one step. Okay. Let me sort of draw first any reflections. So as I said, the first part of the reading looks a lot at the question of growth and that taxonomy that helps you understand the measurement process of growth, how it's accounted for. The second part looks a lot at the emphasis of creating country-based growth narratives or stories of countries' own respective growth trajectories and what lessons one may learn from that. The second part would be sort of also a starting point for much of our dialogue on Thursday, because the way we start looking at later India and China is to see them as cases, right? Cases of growth stories, and trying to learn from their own stories as unique possibilities. There are always commonalities in the nature of concerns countries at similar stages of development might have, which gives us useful tools for theorizing. I mean, the conceptual categories of neo-patrimonial states, cohesive capitalist states, they're all conceptual categories drawn from certain features that are common. But the idea, which I think many cases models within economics tend to universalize, or by the nature of assumptions you draw, is problematic in a certain sense, is that many of the analytical findings may remain context independent. And that makes things a little bit more tricky from the perspective of knowing a country better and its context in which it is operating. So while it may be fair to say that, oh, reduction in tariffs or reduction in quotas will naturally make you more integrated with the rest of the world, and that helps you grow over time. The finding that reduction of these trade barriers by its own nature will make you grow is not true. It depends on a lot of factors. In fact, one of the most sort of cliched responses that you would ask an economist in a question like that would be that the answer would lie in the nature of what it depends on, or in identifying what it depends on, because you have to look at factors which are conditional on the country's performance, how productive its land is, how productive its workforce is, how productive its capital is, how much of entrepreneurial vision, investment, technological growth, all of these will contribute significantly to growth outcomes. One policy change or reducing restrictions to trade barriers, or let's say making changes with your exchange rate, will not by its own meaning and nature cause that. And models are able to predict those outcomes because they operate under the assumption, as most of you would know, those who've done basic 101 economics, ceteris paribus, right? Which is other factors are kept constant or other variables are kept constant. So you're trying to determine causal interdependence or a deterministic relationship between two variables and studying their relationship, keeping others constant. Now, growth and the functioning of growth, as this reading talks about, and as most of those studying growth trajectories will tell you, is a function of many things. I mean, yes, land productivity matters. I mean, those are what the author here defines are the proximate determinants to growth. Okay. So the chart that you look in front of you is helping you draw out the taxonomy in more detail. And my objective here is for even a student who has no background in economics should be able to see this and make sense, which is an objective sort of criteria of introducing this. The measurement of growth as the accounting process of growth is understood in the discipline of economics is in the first three boxes, right? And that if you look at the top, income, factor endowments, and productivity. So much of the science of growth accounting is based there. How you measure and to what extent you see factors of production becoming more productive, and what amount of income, as in Y, in many cases, is coming as a function of those productive investments in land, technology, capital, workers, that will determine your growth possibility. So that is still true, more or less, in context to many countries. If overall people's income on an average is growing, and by average, I mean, of course, you take segregated averages as well to see how inclusive that shared growth point is, so that it's not as if that the top 5% are growing and the bottom 20% are sort of getting more immersed in poverty. But on average, if incomes of people is growing over time, there is a natural tendency for their consumption power to enable their purchasing power capabilities enhanced. They're able to aspire, consume goods and services which are over and above the basic essentials. And that's good, right? So growth as a function of income accumulation or wealth accumulation is not by its own very nature an issue. That is still pretty much the case as how growth was measured in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and much so now. The addition to that growth analytical framework is pretty much in the addition of the deeper determinants of growth, not the proximate alone, which is the introduction of the terms you would have come across of geography, institutions, and integration. Now, this is more recent. much, I mean, there's a huge debate in the distributive aspects of understanding growth. Where countries which were growing at, let's say, 7%, 8% on GDP terms, it was being said that, well, even if they're growing at that level, doesn't mean everybody's part of that growth story, right? Which is that everybody is benefiting as a result of firms' production capacity rising or government spending more money, whatever the scenario might be. And as a result, I think this brought a sort of a deeper dialogue within the discipline. It led to the foundations of the core of what we in modern terms call as development economics. Development economics as a field sort of originated to look at the distributive concerns of growth accounting. I mean, otherwise the topic of growth accounting was restricted to macroeconomics, MACRO. And macroeconomics is what as a subject would deal with just accounting of growth, right? So as to speak, where you would look at income, factor endowments, productivity, and just keep delving sort of in what level of, I mean, the question would be what level of investment in human capital will make you grow at 8%. Those were the questions that macroeconomists would ask. And yeah, you'd come with some sort of all kinds of complicated modeled sort of assumptions and sort of findings to come with a particular number that, or given at the stage of the development and economy is in, or given the resources it has, this is what maybe 10% or 5% is what it should be spending or investing. Those questions are still relevant, as I said, but the idea that by the nature of ensuring that investment will take care of all your distributive concerns and issues and developmental problems was too far-fetched. And that led to the creation. So scholars like who you must have heard about, Amartya Sen, Mehboob ul Haq, Joseph Stiglitz, these scholars, or I mean, Darren Acemoglu and others are more in the sort of recent years, but they created a sort of a churn as economists to argue for the need of development economics as a field, which would bring other aspects to study growth as well. And that brought into question these three components that you see: institutions, integration, and geography as critical deterministic criteria. Now, what you see as boxes mentioned are bifurcated in two determinants of growth, proximate and deeper determinants. But they're all helping you understand how to measure, account, and in basic terms, understand the growth trajectory of an economy. To what extent? So you see there are a lot of arrows mentioned that are connecting these boxes. The arrows represent what in the chapter you would have come across is the tone of interrelationships, which is the relationship between each of these boxes. So in any country which you take as an example, to what extent its growth is an outcome of the nature of reform that its institutions took for a period of time. So reforms taken in public institutions, introduction to private property rights, things like those which would have brought greater significance. We were talking about trade policy, right? So that would be brought under a discussion on institutions again. So trade policy change, industrial policy change, labor market changes, introduction of higher minimum wage. We were discussing something around those lines. So if you take those interventions which are coming more or so from the state, institutional reform can create a pathway for greater growth possibilities to be realized. So that relationship will be functional and operational to the way growth would be understood. At the same time, you can look at the role of geography being very essential to the way a nation organizes its economic activity. A lot of countries you see which are rich in minerals or rich in non-renewables, limited resources, they shape their economy around the trade for these goods and services, and they diversify their portfolio over time. For those who are able to do that, they are able to then make the economy less resource dependent. For many countries which still do that, which is the major revenue comes from the export of one main resource, right? As it could be oil, it could be I don't know, semiconductor chips. And if your entire economy is dependent around those trades, you will see that they would sort of operate under what is popularly defined as a resource curse. So just because they have a comparative advantage in something as limited in supply as a particular good or a resource, their entire economy is shaped around that. So if the prices of that, and we were talking about Venezuela briefly earlier, if the prices of the oil being exported out of Venezuela in the international market comes down, its revenue margins will come down. It will affect from not just the oil sector, but the overall economy, because it's too tied to their oil space. So geography's relationship with the overall growth story of a country is, as an interrelationship, an important aspect to study. But as you would have come across in the page 9 to that second part, there are certain characteristic features as assumptions that they've tried to show that countries, by the leading their examples, have defied. So there is an example, there's a line, for example, mentioned there of geography not being destiny, which is the fact that there are countries where you find examples where they're not rich in limited resources, they're not rich in oil, they're not rich in soil fertility or cultivable crop patterns, they're not even accessible to trading routes. A country like Australia, for that matter, and they've still been able to navigate through geographical limitations just by largely the power of institutional reform and smart sort of thinking around policies and get into higher income trajectory. So geography and its role and its relationship is critical. Similarly, integration. Now, integration is studied here from two verticals around. They're not talking about actually labor market integration or free mobility of people to move from one market to the other, but they're talking about trade. They're talking about capital integration or investment, what you call as foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, capital investment moving more freely between markets, trade moving more freely between markets. So by now there is, I mean, amongst political class, maybe perhaps it's still in a medieval sense, not aware of advancements in intellectual capacity, but there is a reasonable consensus now that trade makes countries better off, right? Restrictions to trade inadvertently affect um, the markets of goods and services. And it's not a one-to-one relationship. So it's not as if that if you are importing something, you expect the immediate sort of favorable terms of trade for another country to offer you on a one-to-one basis. It differs at different points, at different capabilities and capacities. But the relationship of integration with countries, right, on and off, will help you understand their growth trajectory. A country which is trading a lot in limited natural resources may over time may not continue to be only trading in that. I mean, a very good example is UAE, for example. UAE's entire economy has been oil dependent and linked for reasonably long period of time. But if you see that what it did with the sort of development of Dubai, as a sort of a business hub, it's been able to attract very high amount of capital investment in developing Dubai to boost, let's say, tourism, services, financial services, many of those sectors for which a lot of the revenue generation really happens for United Arab Emirates. That's made possible through integration. It's not made possible through integration only in trading of, agricultural commodities or oil for that matter, but diversifying their portfolio. One might argue that they can do better, but there is still a considerable progress in the last 20 years in the UAE's ability as a sort of a large market to attract capital investment, which is beyond oil and other areas. So why the relationship between proximate and deeper determinants shape fundamentally the trajectory of growth in a country? You can look at these arrows as points of interrelationship between the determinants and study these in effect of a particular case and understand in context to a particular situation how a country is growing or not growing as a result of the nature of relationship you are taking. Now, there are these terms which are used on the left side, which are talking about endogeneity and exogeneity. I just want to sort of clarify what these words mean. Endogenous in a fundamental sense means something which is internal to the process of growth. Okay, something you can study in a more sort of internalized manner. Land is very sort of, in a sovereign sense, territorial to a country's own identity, right? Geographical identity. I mean, to say that the land that you want to make productive is outside that sovereign space will not be applicable to a country's profile. So India has the land what it has. It has to make what it has more productive as possible. It cannot anticipate to occupy another land and then sort of say that make that more productive and accessible. It was a very useful example of Trump's foreign policy agenda being explained by a term more recently by an historian. I think you must have heard of him if some of you have. His name is Neil Ferguson. You can listen to some of his podcasts. He's more on the sort of conservative Republican side of things, but he uses the word real estateonomics to define Trump's sort of foreign policy agenda. So he comes from a very sort of a construction construction real estate mind. So whenever he's dealing and trading on issues with countries, his real estate sort of over dominates his consideration of thought. I think that's not a complete inaccurate characterization. There is this, I mean, the whole issue with West Bank and making that the Riviera of the Middle East, and then talking about other of those issues. There is evidence of talking about this in context to developing or accessing real estate for more capital investment. So each of what will be seen as something which is internalized to the process of growth, accounting for a country, each factor, whether it's land, whether it's labor, whether it's capital. The assessment of labor productivity in most countries happen under the assumption of the labor supply being fixed. I know it's a gross misinterpretation because labor is constantly moving. Workers are constantly moving. There's immigration also happening. There's a big of those issues. But when you talk about productivity in terms of workforce participation measurement, you're talking about a fixed labor supply of what the country has, which is of its own citizenry. It will not be able to include what is not part of the sort of profiling of the sovereign workforce presence. If somebody comes into the country and occupies an identity, so for example, if I'm offering my services visiting in here, I'm not part of the framework of assessment of labor force participation because I'm here as sort of in a temporary worker capacity and I sort of disappear after a period of time. So policies will not be shaped as a result of my presence or absence. I will not be a big swing factor, so as to speak. A lot of other things matter and a lot of other cases matter. So there's always a lot of focus on workforce also being looked from a very internalized sovereign setting, like land. And so is the case with technology and entrepreneurship. So each of the factors, when viewed from an assessment of an internalized manner, will be deemed as an endogenous way. It's a perspective of looking at things. You can look at things from an exogenous perspective, or you can look at things as an endogenous perspective. Exogenous would be seen as something which is external to the process. Things may or may not be in your control, things outside the purview of your lens. Foreign policy factors don't depend only on our own discretion. As a small trading nation, we may be impacted by some leader who has announced reciprocal tariffs and it's affecting our markets, even though we have directly not, being affected. The indirect effect of those retaliatory, structures would have an impact. So those kind of things have a huge meaning in the way a lot of the trade is sort of organized. So exogenous is something which is seen as external to the process of growth, and endogenous would be seen as something which is more internal to the process of growth. Institutions and integration as two determinants are seen here as partly endogenous, given the fact that you can't only see them from one perspective. Like you can't analyze integration from only the perspective of one country or one institution, because trade happens between two or more parties. So there has to be the other side where you're trying to make sense. Institutional reform, not everything can be seen in institutional reform as things happening as a result of internalized domestic change. There are external factors. There is international law. There is international conventions, agreements, human right based discourses, which you may be a party to. And as by the nature of being a signatory or a party, you may have to make certain adjustments to your domestic institutional reform. So you can't completely internalize it, saying that this is all happening as a result of your own thinking, your own social institutions, or your own cultural norms. So the words used here, endogeneity and exogeneity, are perspectives to look at the determinants of growth. And the relationships between these determinants to growth is what is of acute and important significance for where we take the course from here on. Why there is enough emphasis on talking about this taxonomy is because it tries to give you a sort of a more balanced perspective in the economics of growth, to be not only understood from income, wealth, or factors of production and their productivity concerns. As important as they are and as they may be, you do need investment in land, you do need investment in capital. I mean, the whole assumption behind, for example, I mean, we were talking about this in the Canadian context in the last class as well. It may appear that there is a huge impetus of capital being the source of, or the mode of production, right? When I say capital as being the mode of production, you invest more in investment in sectors, in contracts, in, sort of making sure that markets are the way in which markets are the tools in which your guiding allocation of resources are being shaped upon, and governments are deciding on that. My sort of observatory anecdote on the Canadian economy is that it's not at all in any way functioning on many capitalist principles, while it projects and positions itself to be. I mean, one big example, I think, of that is if you pick any sector in the Canadian economy, most of those, not just dairy or agriculture for that matter, look at aviation, look at telecom, somebody was talking about groceries the other day. It's all dominated by 2 or 3 or largely maybe maximum 4 players at large. The first basic principle of market identity for any nation state is to allow for a reasonably freer and sort of lack of restrictive entry-exit mechanism for firms. The other thing is the nature of entrepreneurial capabilities that a sort of a larger nation state in its institutional policy mechanism is able to nurture. So do you see a lot of people being able to set up new businesses at will? And if that is being encouraged, then you do see then that sectors that capital or basis of capital mode of production and distribution would organize. Now, that may pretty much be the case. Maybe it's in the case of, let's say, ICT, information communication technology. Maybe it is in the case of some particular sector. I don't know. But when you're reviewing things from the perspective of one disposition, whether it's coming from an organizing principle or an ideological contour, I think what you have to look at is whether an economy at large and the story of its growth trajectory is demonstrating that features as accurately as possible, because you'll need a reference point. Now, is it capitalism will not be one brand of capitalism. There are many isms. You have an American model of capitalism, which is very different from how, the East Asian model of capital-oriented structures work. And we want to sort of look at that. At the same time, you have countries where the model of a socialist structure, as quite often Noam Chomsky used to argue, was that the word socialist was abused by both parties. You have the word socialist being corrupted by the Soviet Union and other sort of establishments which would use it for its own propaganda based sort of idea of getting community in order. And you'd have other ways of looking at socialism, which, let's say, in the American conceptualization of a Cold War polarized agenda would look at socialism as, in a sort of adversarial negative sense, as something which is counterproductive to growth. Talking about society and the well-being of society at large and working towards that is not fundamentally in any sense quote unquote wrong, because it's part of your growth trajectory and your policy making. So what happens is, I think, in political theory and the interpretation of classical political theory, a lot of these concepts, I think, have over time, as part of philosophical abstractions, increasingly also become disconnected with the nature of growth trajectories or country-based profiles each of the countries have adopted. I mean, see them as models that they've adapted and endogenized. So they have their own models and versions. But to say that one model and version is exactly equivalent of another, I think there are common features, but there are differences. And I think that's the exercise here. As growth model of each country, there are certain factors that matter more in shaping that. At the same time, you will find that the nature of institutional reform would advocate to a certain degree of, in a certain sense, some ideological measure, which a leadership or a party or a government in power would have its own interpretative meaning of, and it will use it to give its own sort of reference point. And there you will find that that interpretative meaning would be quite different from how actually a lot of things may in theory be explained. We were mentioning about carbon tax, right, for example, or you were talking about earlier other references. So in the sort of universal application of addressing challenges on environmental safeguarding measures, maybe it's sort of a tool which should be argued. But if countries interpret and apply it in different mechanisms and meanings, that meaning may be lost and may be received in different terms. Maybe some countries are receiving a carbon tax measure in a very different way. Like, I'll give you another reference point, which is NTBs. I was talking about non-tariff barriers. Already amongst non-tariff barriers in many countries, importing commodities are being adjudicated based on the imprint of carbon use, which the EU market, for example, may be able to regulate. And it may be completely within the norms of its regulatory structure to say that we will not import a particular product which has a larger use in terms of carbon footprint. Maybe let's say air conditioners, right? So if air conditions and the use of air conditioners is going to increase because of greater or more heating in the region, we will not use certain products that would have a greater carbon footprint, or the pricing of these would be much more higher. And companies are actually adapting to those norms. I mean, that process is happening. So whether it's ideological, whether it's philosophical, whether it is in terms of the accounting mechanism of growth or the deterministic relationship between proximate and deeper determinants, each of these are contextually defined by a country's own growth story, which is the role of what we define as narratives to growth. So each narrative will tell you or explain you over time what path a country has chosen. Maybe it has abandoned down the line, and at the same time given another meaning to it. But the framework or the tool that you can use as a taxonomy or a guiding reference is perhaps this framework, which the author in the text in the first 8 pages defines and describes. I want to just take quickly the last sort of 6 to 7 minutes to draw some reflections on what you would have read and understood in brief passing of at least the first 8 pages on the framework part, or anything otherwise that you would want to sort of share in reflection of what you would have read. That would be helpful. And we'll take much of our, I think, conversation forward on growth narratives in the next session on Thursday. So I'll start again with a recap of the framework and then take that forward. But any questions, any reflections, any thoughts? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Nothing to think. Let me. Hey, Jonathan, I think you joined recently or what? I
No,
just
how
saw
was
you.
you?
Yeah. Okay. Peter, Steph, anything, any reflection, or Marta for that matter, Louise, Laura, all talked out for today.
I have no thoughts today. Sorry. Rough morning.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick reflection. So my background is this is the first economics course that I've taken. So I just found, what in your conclusion, what you said about the different types of capitalism. I just think that's very interesting, and I'll have to think about that, that the American model is very different from potentially the Canadian model. And so when we're thinking in the social sciences, especially in feminist and gender studies, when we talk about capitalism, I think one of the disadvantages, and this goes back to how, all of the social sciences are sort of separated, and siloed, and how problematic that is in terms of us thinking about these larger structures and the importance of context, because we talk about, context within, gender and race and sexuality, but it is really, I mean, it's very important, and this has been very interesting for me to have that insight into the, the models of capitalism as well, that we have to think about them in terms of their context, which, I mean, for yourself and many other students in this class is a no-brainer, but you really, it's very reflective. And of course, then thinking about China and potentially India as well. I mean, I think this will allow me some food for thought over the next couple of days, as as I think about, our lecture on Thursday, that the importance of context is so essential in terms of understanding these large systems that govern us all across the globe. I mean, I know it's self-evident, but in many ways, sometimes it isn't, because we do go down very narrow paths of thinking sometimes, and so um it's important to, have these different subjects actually inform and speak to each other when we're doing academic inquiry.
No, so I mean, one of the things I've mentioned it, and I think this has been reasonably well received here, versus how I approach similar sort of questions and conversations back in India, because of the, I think, very extensive, heavy, preconditioned understanding of Marxist interpretations of a very critical and almost over a period of time cynical view on thinking around capitalist term. Even the terminology by its own nature becomes so heavily loaded that you can't even enter into a constructive dialogue. I've tried a lot doing that, and I think by the idea is always to start with that provocation and take with every session ways and means to sort of engage in different forms. Because if every time you start with the same question, you lose a chunk of people who would say, oh, this is an act of brainwashing coming from, another side of the story, which is a Chicago school of thought or something like that, or a libertarian sort of perspective. The idea is to actually see this from the perspective of application rather than concept. If you apply what you see in theory, what nation states have done, they all have taken, it's like almost theological. You may have a structure of a text which is considered extremely pious, in context to the religious doctrines, but a preacher of that text would have their own meanings. And by the time, to someone you are trying to uh, incubate a belief or a code of ethic, to sort of understand, their own ways and means get interpreted in many forms. But it doesn't mean that there are not certain principles or organizing principles to that piece of thought. And in fact, the debate is really right there, which is on the organizing principles. But even those principles are applied in different forms. And my sense is that the Canadian example it's divorced very much from the American example, but there are bits and pieces of applying similar principles of what the US does. Like, I'm seeing a lot of this, and I was speaking to someone who does a lot of work in the economics of immigration. And he's based in Carleton. And he said that a lot of the change in immigration policies in Canada in the last sort of whatever 7-8 years is sort of following or tiptoeing a lot from what the US has been doing, right? And becoming extremely sort of vigilant, restrictive, and skeptical, so as to speak, or moving towards criminalizing a lot of the sort of immigrant workforce, not just looking at the issue of documented, undocumented, but in general. And that perceptive commonality is born out of a common sort of thinking process. So that may pretty much be true, and may be part of a larger wave of anti-immigration politics. But what I try, I think, to ask and implore sort of students to do is to sort of caution themselves from not seeing any form of ism as one which is an over dominant hierarchy, which is common in its meaning, interpretation, and also application. Because that, when you will start distancing yourself from all the three levels, you'll find that there is a difference in application across the board. So there's in fact a very useful text, because since earlier, I think it was Peter maybe who mentioned financial markets somewhere, which was the sort of US financial crisis. But this text, I think, which is perhaps, I don't know if it is mentioned in your option of book reviews, and maybe one of you can correct me. But this text called Saving Capitalism from the Capitalist, which is a reading by um, an Indian, economist based at the Chicago School, but with Luis Zingales, who's a Latin American scholar, brings out with, I think this text tried to deal with some of this question, which is that you need to sort of distance what capitalism preaches versus how capitalists work. And Marx was actually, in fact, calling this thing out. He conceded that capital is the main mode of organizing production. A lot of people forget that, and Smith is also conscious of this. So you have all sorts of classical thinkers who acknowledge the importance of capital, but at the same time, they are on the distributive end of things, very concerned about how capitalists function, how firms function, how merchants function. Now you have an advocate of a free trade market model saying that any law coming from a merchant should be, as much as possible, heavily scrutinized, which is Smith that I'm talking about earlier, means that there is a degree of skepticism, because there is a tendency to accumulate capital. So this is the CEO model of capitalism, right? One is trying to caution. And that, I think, there is a unanimous agreement that concentration of wealth in the hands of few is not desirable. It does not yield. But the same point is actually on the reverse it's true of forced equalization of capital, which is that you can't use aggressive coercive measures to just say that impose a 40% wealth tax and 20% wealth tax, or a 10% wealth tax, and like all your problems in inequality would be addressed. There's a big, and I don't want to sort of get into that as the sort of closing point in the conversation today, but I would urge for everyone to sort of look into this. All right, it's 11:32. I'll pause here. We will get on to this on Thursday. May I just request everyone, guys, as we close, and recording band kar dijiye. Sorry, AV team, if somebody is there, or I can just pause this. One of the things that I was hoping that you could just